At 85 years old, Shirley Caesar has broken her silence, and what she finally revealed has left fans devastated. Behind the sermons, the awards, and that unforgettable voice, there's a truth even her closest followers never knew. A lifetime of heartbreak, sacrifice, and untold battles hidden beneath gospel robes and stage lights. Why did she keep it all in? And what legacy is she leaving behind? This is the tragedy we never saw coming. The hidden childhood pain that shaped her voice. On October 13, 1938, in Durham, North Carolina, Shirley Ann Caesar was born, the 10th of 13 children in a small house that barely held them. Her father, James Caesar, was a tobacco laborer by day and a traveling preacher by Sunday. Their home didn't have much, no running water, no heat, and often not enough food. But what it did have was music. Hymns filled the air before sunrise, and scripture echoed through the cracked walls. In that environment, Shirley learned that faith wasn't a belief. It was survival. The first heartbreak struck early. When Shirley was just 7 years old, her father passed away. He had been the family's spiritual anchor, and his death created a silence that no hymn could fill. Her mother, Shirley Caesar, became both provider and protector. She worked long hours as a maid, came home to cook, and still managed to pray over her children each night. In that storm, Shirley saw a light in Shirley. At 8 years old, Shirley sang her first solo in church. People didn't just hear her, they felt her. One elder said, "She sang like she'd already lived 100 years." Shirley's voice wasn't trained, it was touched. It trembled with grief, roared with joy, and whispered something holy. By age 9, neighbors were already calling her Little Caesar. Music became her therapy. It helped her process the ache of her father's absence and the weight of being poor in the Jim Crow South. When she opened her mouth to sing, she wasn't performing. She was praying. And for a child carrying the loss of a parent and the burden of poverty, gospel wasn't just a genre. It was her refuge, her rebellion, and her reason to keep going. She often said, "I didn't choose gospel, gospel chose me." That calling wasn't glamorous. It meant singing when she was tired, smiling when she was hurting, and praying even when she had questions. But it also gave her power, a gift that would one day shake stadiums. The voice that had once filled her tiny living room in Durham would soon echo across the nation. But before the awards, the albums, or the title of First Lady of Gospel, there was just a little girl with a broken heart and a heavenly voice. That pain became her purpose and her sound. As Shirley's voice grew louder, so did her purpose. By the time most kids were still learning to read music, she was already ministering through it. Churches across the South began calling, not just for a performance, but for a presence. What happens when a child born from loss becomes a vessel for healing? At just 10 years old, Shirley Caesar wasn't chasing fame. She was answering a divine appointment, and that journey would take her far beyond her hometown of Durham. The prodigy who became a preacher through song. By age 10, Shirley Caesar had already outgrown local choirs. Pastors from as far as Raleigh, Charlotte, and Greensboro invited her to sing. She became known as Little Caesar, a child whose voice didn't just move people, it moved the spirit. She wasn't a novelty, she was a force. With no formal training and no microphone, Shirley filled sanctuaries with a sound that blended lament and liberation. A visiting bishop once said, "When she sings, it's not performance, it's prophecy." And even at that tender age, Shirley understood her gift was a responsibility. Life behind the scenes, however, remained difficult. While she performed in starched dresses before large congregations, at home, the electricity was often cut off, and dinner sometimes meant bread and syrup. Her mother remained her greatest cheerleader, balancing multiple jobs to keep the family afloat while still encouraging Shirley to sing through the struggle. School, too, was a tightrope. She'd travel for performances on weekends and then return to Hillside High School during the week, sometimes too exhausted to focus, but too determined to quit. Her teachers marveled at her discipline. Her classmates? They just knew not to miss a church night when Shirley was singing. By 12, Shirley had a small but growing reputation. Pastors began calling her not just a singer, but a preacher through music. She had a way of weaving scripture into her melodies, transforming hymns into healing. She didn't just sing about Jesus, she sang to him, and people could feel the difference. Audiences didn't applaud. They wept. They shouted. They surrendered. And yet, fame never changed her posture. Even with local newspapers beginning to take notice in 1951, Shirley kept her head down and her heart open. Her humility wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. Shirley knew that gifts without grounding are dangerous, and in a world where Black women were often ignored or dismissed, she chose to let her gift speak for itself. She wasn't chasing a spotlight, she was walking in obedience. The same voice that had comforted her grieving siblings was now comforting strangers in pews. By the time she was 14, Shirley had already decided what her life would be. Not a career, but a calling. And the next chapter would take her from rural churches to the national stage. At just 18 years old, Shirley Caesar took a leap that would forever alter the course of gospel music. She joined the Caravans, an all-star group of gospel legends that dominated the 1950s and early 1960s. Surrounded by giants like Albertina Walker and James Cleveland, Shirley found herself in a spiritual boot camp. But could a teenager from Durham survive and thrive in a group where every voice was iconic? The stage was set, and Shirley was ready to rise. Breaking in with the Caravans. In 1956, at just 18 years old, Shirley Caesar boarded a bus and never looked back. She had been invited to join the Caravans, already one of the most powerful gospel groups in America. Led by Albertina Walker, with voices like Inez Andrews and James Cleveland, the Caravans weren't just singers, they were ministers of music. The stakes were high, and the expectations even higher. Shirley wasn't handed a spotlight. She had to earn it. But as soon as she opened her mouth, the other singers knew. This girl had fire in her bones. Life on the road was brutal. The group traveled city to city, sometimes hitting 3 churches in a single day. They slept on buses, in borrowed homes, and occasionally in rooms where the heat didn't work. There were racist encounters, low pay, and spiritual warfare behind the scenes. But Shirley endured. Her breakout moments came with songs like Sweeping Through the City and I'm Not Tired Yet. Audiences would shout, cry, and sometimes faint. Her voice was thunder dipped in honey, powerful but deeply comforting. And soon, she wasn't just a Caravan member, she was their rising star. But even in the spotlight, Shirley remained grounded. She studied Albertina's leadership, learned from Cleveland's arrangements, and treated each performance like a sermon. These weren't just songs, she would say later. These were sacred stories. Over the next 9 years, Shirley would tour with the Caravans across dozens of states, singing in cities like Chicago, Atlanta, and Detroit. Her stage presence was electric. She stomped, shouted, and sobbed through every lyric. The crowd didn't just come for the music. They came for the move of God that always followed her set. By 1965, Shirley's voice had become synonymous with emotional truth. But the road was wearing on her. Long nights, little rest, and an increasing pull toward solo ministry began tugging at her spirit. She knew she was being prepared for something else, something lonelier, riskier, but more personal. The caravans had given her wings, but it was time for her to fly on her own. What came next would shock the gospel world and cement Shirley Caesar as a pioneer with no equal. In 1966, Shirley Caesar did the unthinkable. She walked away from the caravans at the peak of their fame to follow a voice only she could hear. No label deal, no choir behind her, just a woman, a mic, and a mission. The gospel world gasped. But Shirley knew what she was doing. God wasn't calling her to comfort. He was calling her to courage. And with that, she stepped into the unknown and history. Walking away from the spotlight to obey a higher call. In 1966, Shirley Caesar stunned the gospel world. At just 28 years old, she left the caravans, gospel's most celebrated group. After nearly a decade of tours, sold-out churches, and rising stardom, she chose to walk away, not for fame, but for faith. God told me it was time, she said. Many thought she was making a mistake. No solo female gospel artist had ever reached the level she was walking away from. But Shirley wasn't chasing applause. She was chasing obedience. Her first solo album, My Testimony, released in 1966, wasn't just music. It was a message. Each song told a chapter of her life, losing her father, finding her voice, leaving everything familiar behind. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't marketed with big budgets. But it resonated. Shirley sang like she had nothing to prove and everything to pour out. Church after church booked her, but the crowds were smaller. The checks were smaller. Yet the spirit? It was greater. She called those early solo years her refining season. The gospel industry didn't know what to do with a woman out on her own. Radio DJs hesitated. Promoters doubted. But Shirley kept going, city after city, sermon after sermon. Her voice didn't just fill the room, it filled the hurt in people's hearts. In tiny rural churches, people lined up to cry at the altar after she sang. In major cities, pastors whispered, "She's got something different." And she did, because she wasn't just performing, she was ministering with every breath. By the early 1970s, Shirley Caesar's impact could no longer be ignored. Albums like I Remember Mama and Jesus, I Love Calling Your Name established her as a solo force. She had defied expectations, opened a new lane for women in gospel, and proved that purpose was louder than popularity. Her leap of faith became a blueprint, and it marked the beginning of a legacy that would echo across generations. As her solo career soared, Shirley Caesar didn't stay boxed inside church walls. She believed gospel was too powerful to be confined. So, while others stayed safe in tradition, she crossed into new territory. What happens when the First Lady of Gospel walks into Hollywood, shares a stage with Whitney Houston, or shows up on television screens across the nation? The answer? Shirley didn't just cross over. She took the altar with her. Crossing over without compromise. In the late 1980s and 1990s, Shirley Caesar became a bridge between the sacred and the mainstream. She didn't try to water down her message, she just let her voice speak for itself. When she collaborated with Whitney Houston on He's All Over Me, For the 1996 film The Preacher's Wife, it was more than a duet. It was a moment. The song reached millions, introducing Shirley's anointing to a generation raised on radio, not revival. And yet, not one lyric compromised her message. Before that, Shirley had already won the respect of legends like Mahalia Jackson, who once said, "That girl's got holy fire in her lungs." But it wasn't just gospel royalty who took notice. Soul singers, R&B icons, even Hollywood producers started to seek her out. She appeared in films, on TV specials, and at award shows, always dressed in modest elegance, always preaching through song. And while other artists got lost in fame, Shirley remained grounded in her faith. She became known as the First Lady of Gospel, a title she never asked for, but one she wore with grace. By the year 2000, she had already released over 30 albums and won multiple Grammys. Songs like Hold My Mule and No Charge became more than hits. They became cultural anchors. Her music showed up in barbershops, beauty salons, funerals, and Sunday dinners. She was everywhere, but she never lost herself. What made Shirley's crossover so remarkable was that she never changed her core. While others bent to trends or sought approval, she stayed rooted. "I'm not here to entertain," she once said. "I'm here to edify." And that authenticity made her timeless. Whether she was singing in a storefront church or on national television, Shirley carried the same fire, the same purpose, the same gospel. And it was that unwavering identity that made the world listen. As Shirley conquered stages and shattered ceilings, one thing remained missing: a true partner in purpose. Fame was fulfilling, but lonely. And then, in 1983, everything changed. She met a man whose calling matched hers, Bishop Harold Verferts Williams. Together, they would build not just a marriage, but a ministry. But what happens when even the greatest love stories are touched by loss? The next chapter of Shirley's life would test everything she believed. Love, loss, and a life built on faith. In 1983, at the height of her solo career, Shirley Caesar married Bishop Harold Ivory Williams, presiding prelate of Mount Calvary Holy Church of America. He was a man of deep faith, quiet strength, and unwavering vision. Their union wasn't built on fame. It was built on foundation. Together, they didn't just share love, they shared a mission. "We weren't just married," Shirley once said. "We were yoked." For over 3 decades, their partnership became one of gospel's most admired love stories. They built their life in Raleigh, North Carolina, where they pastored together and co-led outreach ministries. While Shirley sang on stages, Bishop Williams preached from the pulpit. Their home became a place of rest, prayer, and hospitality. There were no tabloid scandals, no public spats, only unity. Shirley often said that Harold gave her what fame never could: peace. For once, she shared in a 2007 interview, "I didn't have to carry it all by myself." But in July 2014, tragedy struck. After more than 30 years of marriage, Bishop Williams passed away. The loss wasn't just emotional, it was spiritual. Shirley had buried her father as a child. Now, as a grown woman, she buried her husband. "I lost my soulmate," she said, "but not my purpose." Her grief was private, but her resilience was public. Just weeks after his passing, she returned to the pulpit, singing through tears, preaching through pain. Despite the ache, Shirley kept the ministry going. She expanded Shirley Caesar Outreach Ministries, launched new community programs, and continued releasing music. Her voice, though now laced with sorrow, was more powerful than ever. Because now, she wasn't just singing to encourage others, she was singing to survive. Love had lifted her, loss had refined her, and her faith, it had never been stronger. But even after decades of sacred service, Shirley Caesar was about to enter the most unexpected chapter of her career. In 2016, her voice became a viral meme. A sermon clip turned into a Thanksgiving dance anthem. Millions laughed, but not everyone saw the joke. Suddenly, Shirley was trending. But was this fame or mockery? And how did a gospel legend find herself at the center of a pop culture storm she never asked for? Internet fame, memes, and the unexpected storm. In 2016, Shirley Caesar's voice broke the internet, literally. A clip from her fiery sermon performance of Hold My Mule was remixed into a viral Thanksgiving anthem. I got beans, greens, potatoes, tomatoes. It was everywhere. YouTube, TikTok, BET, even late-night TV. Suddenly, teenagers who had never stepped inside a church were dancing to Shirley's voice. Millions laughed, danced, and shared. For a brief moment, gospel collided with meme culture. Shirley was trending again, but this time, not for her sermons. At first, Shirley welcomed the viral fame. If this gets people to hear the word, she said in a TV One interview, then let it play. She smiled through interviews, embraced the remix, and even joked about it on stage. But behind the scenes, a controversy was brewing. Traditional gospel leaders and church elders began calling the meme disrespectful. Some accused the internet of trivializing sacred work. Others questioned if Shirley had allowed her legacy to be reduced to a joke. Caught in the crossfire, Shirley wrestled with mixed emotions. On one hand, over 50 million views meant her message was reaching farther than ever before. On the other, her sermon, born from sacred conviction, had been chopped into a meme. This ain't just entertainment, she once reminded a young interviewer. This is ministry. The line between relevance and reverence had blurred, and Shirley, though seasoned, wasn't immune to the sting of misinterpretation. Still, she never lashed out. She didn't issue press statements or demand apologies. She simply kept doing what she'd always done: sing, serve, and stay faithful. She understood something few did. Virality is fleeting, but purpose endures. The internet might forget her next week, but God hadn't. Shirley Caesar wasn't trying to be remembered for a meme. She was trying to be remembered for the message. But while the world laughed and danced, few saw what was happening behind Shirley's smile. Fame can be noisy, but grief is quiet. And when the crowds went home, when the cameras turned off, she was still just a woman who had lost much, carried more, and rarely let it show. Because behind every powerful voice, there's often a private storm no one hears. The weight of the crown. Behind the applause, the Grammys, the titles, there was a woman holding it all together with trembling hands. Shirley Caesar's career, now spanning over 7 decades, came with an invisible burden. She had been touring non-stop since the 1950s, sometimes doing 200 shows a year. The exhaustion, unrelenting. The pressure, unforgiving. I've cried in green rooms more than I've cried at home, she admitted in a 2019 documentary. Fame gave her a platform, but it also stole her privacy. The physical toll was immense. Years of performing in heels, under hot lights, with a hoarse throat and no rest led to health complications she kept hidden. Her voice, her greatest gift, often came at a cost. and emotionally, she carried the weight of her father's early death, her mother's sacrifices, and the recent grief of losing her husband. Every time she stood on stage, she was standing on top of pain most people never knew about. As the First Lady of Gospel, Shirley was expected to smile, shout, and soar, always. But off-stage, she battled loneliness, moments of spiritual fatigue, and the feeling of being forgotten in an industry now obsessed with youth and digital fame. While she mentored young artists behind the scenes, she often returned to an empty house. No children to come home to, no partner to hold her hand. "Sometimes the silence is louder than the applause," she once whispered during a late-night radio show. Yet, through it all, she never stopped. Never stopped singing. Never stopped serving. Never stopped believing. She leaned on scripture like oxygen. "Be not weary in well-doing," she'd remind herself. Shirley didn't need pity. She needed peace. And the crown she wore so gracefully? It was heavy, but she never let it fall. Because her calling wasn't about comfort. It was about commitment. For decades, fans watched her shine, but never saw her break. Now, at 85, Shirley Caesar is finally pulling back the curtain. What she's revealing isn't scandal, it's humanity. The truth she's sharing, it's what many have long suspected, that even the strongest warriors bleed in silence. And now, she's giving us a glimpse of the woman behind the title. Secrets she never shared. After a lifetime of silence, Shirley Caesar is finally telling her truth. Not in anger, not in bitterness, but in release. In recent interviews, she's opened up about the quiet wounds that shaped her legacy, chief among them, the ache of never having children. Despite over 30 years of marriage to Bishop Harold Williams, the two never had biological children. "I have spiritual sons and daughters all over the world," she said in a 2022 church conference. But yes, sometimes the house gets very quiet. Her grief was not just about absence, but about expectation. As a gospel matriarch, fans assumed she had a bustling home, grandchildren, a legacy behind the scenes. But Shirley chose not to speak on it. Until now. "Some wounds aren't meant to be exposed until they've scarred over," she said softly. She didn't want pity. She wanted people to understand that purpose doesn't always come wrapped in the life we planned. There were other battles too. Betrayals from inside the church, people she helped who turned on her, and seasons of burnout so intense she nearly quit. "I wanted to scream," she confessed in a 2023 podcast, "but I had to smile instead, because I was the face of faith." Shirley endured criticism for how she dressed, how she preached, even how she grieved. But through it all, she chose silence, not as weakness, but as protection. Now, as she steps into her most honest season, Shirley is letting go of the myths. She's no longer carrying it alone. "There's healing in honesty," she told a group of young gospel artists. "Tell your truth. Don't wait until you're 85. Her confession is not a fall from grace. It's a rise into wholeness. And in this moment, the gospel queen becomes something even more powerful, human. So what happens when a legend stops hiding and starts healing? Shirley Caesar is no longer just a singer, or a preacher, or a pioneer. She is a testimony. And whether this is her final act, or just the beginning of something new, one thing is clear. Her voice is far from finished. The final act. At 85 years old, Shirley Caesar is doing what few legends dare. She's evolving, not retreating, not slowing down, evolving. In 2024, she released new music, delivered sermons across the South, and continued mentoring rising voices like Tasha Cobbs, Yolanda Adams, and Leandria Johnson. Her voice, while aged, still soars with power. Her sermons still leave crowds in tears. She says old age is God turning up the volume, and every word she speaks proves it. She no longer seeks the spotlight, but when she walks into a room, people still rise. She's not chasing stages. She's choosing them. Not because she needs the platform, but because the platform still needs her. Shirley spends her days balancing outreach programs, prayer meetings, and quiet time at home. She walks slower now. Her steps are more measured, but her spirit, unshaken. "I'm not finished," she told her congregation in August 2025. "I've just shifted seasons." More than 12 Grammy Awards, more than 40 albums, more than 70 years of ministry. Shirley's greatest legacy may be the lives she touched in silence. The woman who sang through grief, who prayed through betrayal, who preached through pain, is now passing the torch, but not with fanfare, with faith. "I'm not here to compete," she told a young singer backstage. "I'm here to cover you." Whether this is her final act or a brand new beginning, Shirley Caesar has given the world more than music. She's given it strength, honesty, hope. And when the last note fades and the sanctuary empties, one truth will remain. Her voice changed everything. She sang through sorrow, led through storms, and never stopped believing. At 85, Shirley Caesar is no longer just the First Lady of Gospel. She is the embodiment of resilience, truth, and legacy. Her story reminds us that even legends carry wounds, and even the strongest need healing. If this tribute moved you, honor her legacy by sharing, subscribing, and telling us what part hit your heart. Because Shirley's voice may fade, but her impact never will.